Custer County, Nebraska, October 1885. The last of the autumn grass had turned golden across the rolling prairie when Einar Dahl began what his neighbors would later call the most dangerous construction project in the county's short history. While other homesteaders raised proper sod walls toward the open sky, cutting bricks of tough prairie root and stacking them into structures that at least resembled civilized homes. This Norwegian immigrant was doing something that made every experienced builder within 30 miles deeply uneasy. He was digging into the south face of a low hill behind his homestead claim, hauling out cartloads of dark Nebraska earth with a spade and a borrowed mule. And then he was doing something even stranger. He was stacking compressed hay bales against the exposed walls of the hole, 18 inches thick, and smearing them with a paste of river clay and mud that he mixed in a pit beside the excavation. Not a sod house, not a frame shanty, a hole in the ground wrapped in hay. The alarm started immediately. At the general store in Broken Bow, men gathered around Peter Haskell's counter and shook their heads. Women whispered at church. Even the children who played along the South Loop River seemed to understand that something was wrong with what the strange Norwegian was doing. Dahl's lost his mind, they said. Prairie's finally driven him underground. His poor wife, his poor children. But the concern went beyond pity. Thomas Beckwith, a carpenter from Ohio who had built 14 homes across the county, rode out to watch the construction and came back pale. That man has packed 200 pounds of dry hay against a timber frame. He told anyone who would listen. One spark from that stovepipe, and the whole structure burns, and his family is underground with one way out. He's not building a home, he's building a grave. But Einar had not lost his mind. He had not been broken by the prairie. He had brought something with him from the fjords and farmlands of central Norway, a building principle so simple and so ancient that no one on the Nebraska frontier had thought to apply it. Something that within a single winter would force every builder in the county to reconsider everything they thought they knew about shelter, about heat, and about survival on the treeless plains. What did this Norwegian root-cellar builder understand about earth, air, and warmth that everyone around him had missed? Before I reveal the building principle that kept his family alive when the worst blizzard in Nebraska history struck, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Do that, and I promise you'll learn a building technique so effective that modern engineers are paying millions to rediscover its principles today. Because what Einar built in that hillside wasn't primitive. It was centuries ahead of its time. Einar Dahl was never supposed to be on the Nebraska prairie at all. Back in Trondheim, Norway, he had spent 12 years as a farm builder, not a house carpenter, not a furniture maker, but a man who constructed the structures that kept rural Norwegian life functioning through winters that made Nebraska's cold seem almost reasonable. Root cellars dug deep into hillsides, their openings sealed with packed straw and clay. Livestock barns banked on 3 sides with earth and insulated with layers of dried meadowgrass so thick that cattle survived January temperatures of 20 below without supplemental heat. Storage buildings where grain and preserved fish stayed cool in summer and unfrozen in winter, their walls a sandwich of timber, compressed hay, and hand-applied clay plaster that farmers in the Trondheim region had been perfecting for 500 years. Einar understood something that Norwegian farmers had known since the age of the sagas. The ground doesn't freeze the way air freezes. Dig down 5 or 6 feet into the earth, even in the worst winter, and the temperature holds remarkably steady, somewhere between 48 and 55 degrees, depending on the region and the season. Not warm enough for comfort, but warm enough to represent an enormous head start for anyone trying to heat a dwelling. And if you wrap the exposed portions of your structure in thick layers of dried grass or hay, sealed against moisture with clay, you could hold that earth warmth inside with almost no effort. The hay acted like a thick wool blanket drawn over a sleeping child. The clay kept the blanket dry. The earth provided the warmth. All a farmer needed to add was a small fire, and the space would stay comfortable through the darkest months. When he arrived in Custer County in the spring of 1884, Einar brought those instincts with him. He filed his homestead claim on 160 acres along the South Loup River, where the land rose in gentle hills, south of the bottomland. He built a temporary sod house like everyone else and settled in for his first Nebraska winter. He watched carefully, he observed, and what he saw disturbed him deeply. Every home in the scattered settlement followed the same pattern. Sod walls built entirely above ground, 2 feet thick, exposed to wind on all 4 sides. Some families had managed frame shanties, thin lumber walls with gaps that the prairie wind found and exploited mercilessly. The roofs were sod or board with minimal insulation. Every structure sat on the open plain like a box dropped in the middle of a frozen ocean, wind hitting it from the north, the west, the east, cold, radiating up from the frozen ground beneath, heat pouring out through every surface as fast as the stove could produce it. The families who lived in them burned enormous quantities of fuel, twisted hay, dried buffalo chips, expensive coal shipped by rail from Omaha at $12 per ton, sometimes furniture and fence posts when supplies ran short, and still they shivered through January and February. Interior temperatures in the worst homes dropped below 40 degrees on bad nights. Children slept in their coats. Women cooked with numb fingers. Men fed their stoves every 15 to 20 minutes through the dark hours and woke to find frost on the inside of their walls. But worse than the cold was the sickness. Einar noticed that children in the settlement coughed through the winter months, deep rattling coughs that came from breathing frigid air and smoky rooms where damp fuel burned poorly. 2 children in the county had died of pneumonia the previous winter. Others developed chronic respiratory problems that would follow them for years. The connection between cold homes, bad air, and childhood illness was something Einar recognized from Norway, where families who lived in poorly insulated buildings above ground suffered the same afflictions. Families who lived in earth-banked structures did not. Einar knew better than to blame the Nebraska climate. The problem wasn't that the winters were too cold. The problem was that the settlers were trying to heat the sky. A family in an above-ground shanty needed to raise the temperature inside their home by 80 to 90 degrees to reach comfort, from 10 below zero outside to 65 degrees inside. Every surface of their home was losing heat to the frigid air as fast as the stove could produce it. Walls, roof, floor, and, most catastrophically, the door itself, which opened directly into the full force of the prairie wind. Every time someone stepped outside to fetch fuel or check on livestock, The door swung wide, and a blast of sub-zero air rushed in, dropping the room temperature by 5 to 10 degrees in seconds. Minutes of burning to replace what a single door opening destroyed. But a family in a properly built dugout, sheltered by the earth on three sides and the roof above, insulated on the exposed face with thick hay and sealed with clay, that family would start at the Earth's own temperature of 50 to 55 degrees. They would need to add only 10 to 15 degrees of heat to reach comfort. 1/5 the fuel, 1/5 the effort. And if the door opened through a small enclosed vestibule, an airlock that prevented direct wind penetration, even that modest heat would stay where it belonged. The math was simple. The savings would be enormous. The comfort would be transformative. And so in October 1885, when the first hard frosts turned the prairie grass brittle and silver, Einar walked to the south face of the low hill behind his claim, drove a stake into the earth at the spot where the slope was steepest, and began to dig. He started by studying the hillside for 3 days before he cut a single spadeful. He walked the contour at different times of morning and afternoon, watching where the autumn sun hit earliest and lingered longest. He checked the drainage, pouring buckets of water at the hilltop and watching where they ran. He drove a thin iron rod into the earth at several points, measuring the depth of topsoil, the density of the clay beneath, the angle of the bedrock. Only when he was satisfied did he begin excavating. He chose a spot on the south-facing slope, 6 feet below the hilltop, where the earth was a dense mixture of clay and loam that would hold its shape without shoring. He dug a rectangular room 14 feet wide and 18 feet deep into the hillside, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. The rear wall was solid earth, over 12 feet of packed Nebraska prairie stretching back into the hill. Both side walls were earth, tapering from 6 feet of cover at the rear to 3 feet at the front. The ceiling was supported by cottonwood poles laid side by side, then covered with a thick layer of coarse prairie grass to prevent dirt from sifting through, and topped with a double layer of sod blocks and an additional 2 feet of packed earth. Only the front wall, the one facing south, was exposed to outside air. This was where Einar's Norwegian training transformed a simple dugout into something his neighbors had never seen. Against that exposed front wall, and extending 3 feet along each side where the earth cover was thinnest, Einar began stacking compressed hay bales. Not loosely piled, not casually leaned against the structure, but laid in tight overlapping courses like brickwork, each bale fitted snugly against its neighbor, every gap stuffed with loose hay until the wall was a solid mass, 18 inches thick. He had spent 2 weeks cutting and baling prairie hay specifically for this purpose, compressing it with a hand press until each bale was dense enough that he couldn't push a finger through it. Then came the clay. Einar mixed river clay with water and a small amount of chopped straw in a pit beside the dugout, working it by foot until it reached the consistency of thick mortar. He applied this mixture over the entire outer surface of the hay bales in 2 coats, each roughly an inch thick, smoothing it with a wooden trowel until the surface was uniform. The clay served 3 purposes, and Einar understood each one from years of Norwegian practice. First, it waterproofed the hay, preventing rain and snowmelt from penetrating and causing rot. Second, it created a fire-resistant outer shell, a barrier that would char rather than burn if exposed to flame. Third, and most subtly, it managed moisture vapor. The clay was porous enough to allow slow evaporation outward, which meant that any moisture that did reach the hay could escape rather than accumulating. Wet hay rots. Dry hay lasts for decades. He banked additional earth against the clay-covered hay shell, sloping it away from the structure so water would drain downhill rather than pooling against the walls. From a distance, the front of the dugout looked like nothing more than a low mound of earth with a door set into it. A badger hole, his neighbors said, a grave with a chimney. But Einar wasn't finished. He built one more element that none of his neighbors understood, and most of them found ridiculous. In front of the main door, he constructed a small enclosed vestibule, 4 feet deep and just wide enough for one person, with its own outer door. A visitor would open the outer door, step into the vestibule, close the outer door behind them, then open the inner door to enter the dugout. 2 doors, a dead air space between them. His neighbor, Thomas Beckwith, stopped by on the 3rd day of the hay stacking. Beckwith was a careful man, a precise man, an Ohio carpenter who had learned his trade building proper frame houses with proper foundations and proper ventilation. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed and watched Einar press clay over the hay bales with his bare hands. Doll, he said, his voice carrying the careful patience of a man addressing a child. That hay is going to rot by December and catch fire by January. And when it does, your whole family is underground with one way out. You've built yourself a death trap. I've seen hay fires, Doll. They burn at 400 degrees. Your stovepipe will reach 300 at the exit point. That's a 100-degree margin between your family and a fire. 100 degrees. Einar continued pressing clay into the seams between bales. Perhaps, he said simply. We'll see come January. Beckwith shook his head and rode away. What he didn't see was the fire break Einar had built around the stovepipe, a collar of packed earth and flat stones 6 inches thick that separated the metal pipe from the nearest hay by a full 14 inches of non-combustible material. What he didn't understand was that the clay plaster itself would char and harden if exposed to heat, rather than allowing flame to reach the hay beneath. What he couldn't know was that Einar had tested these techniques on Norwegian livestock barns for a decade and never lost a structure to fire. The physics were straightforward, though Einar might not have used those exact terms. The surrounding earth maintained a constant base temperature of approximately 50 to 55 degrees, even when the surface air plunged to 30 below zero. The 18-inch hay wrapping on the exposed front wall provided insulation equivalent to roughly R24 to R27, using modern measurements, several times more effective than a standard 2-foot sod wall that measured perhaps R3 to R5. The clay plaster sealed against wind infiltration while managing moisture. The vestibule airlock prevented the catastrophic heat dumps that occurred every time a standard frontier door opened directly into a winter gale. And the positioning of the stove was deliberate. Einar placed his small cast-iron stove against the rear earth wall, 12 feet from the front entrance. The earth wall behind the stove absorbed heat throughout the day, warming gradually like a stone hearth. At night, when the fire burned low, that earth wall radiated its stored warmth back into the room, maintaining temperature for hours without additional fuel. The doll stove could burn low overnight, and the room would still be above 55 degrees at dawn. Their neighbors' stoves had to be fed every 20 minutes through the night, and still the rooms dropped below 40 by morning. Combined, these elements meant that Einar's small stove could heat the dugout to 65 or 68 degrees and hold it there with minimal fuel, even when outside temperatures reached 30 below. His neighbors needed to raise the temperature 80 or 90 degrees from the frigid outside air to reach comfort, with heat escaping through every wall. Einar needed to raise it 15 degrees from the Earth's constant 50, with the hay holding the warmth in and the Earth holding the cold out. He would burn perhaps 1/5 the fuel of a family in a frame shanty, 1/3 the fuel of a family in a well-built sod house. But none of his neighbors understood this yet. They just saw a man who had buried his family in a haystack and sealed the hole with mud, and they thought him either foolish or dangerous. By Thanksgiving 1885, Einar's dugout was complete, and the settlement along the South Loo River had reached a consensus. The Norwegian had built the most dangerous dwelling anyone had ever seen. At the settlement's late autumn gathering, held in the community hall that Peter Haskell had built beside his general store, the concern became public. The ridicule had teeth now. It came from every direction at once. Thomas Beckwith stood before the assembled families and laid out the case with a carpenter's precision. He had visited the site twice more since his first inspection, measuring, calculating, assessing. "I've examined that structure carefully," he told the room. "The timber framing is adequate. I'll grant him that. But the insulation method is reckless. He's packed 18 inches of compressed hay against the entire front wall and a good portion of the roof. Hay burns at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. His stovepipe exterior will reach 250 to 300 degrees during a hard burn. That leaves a margin of 100 degrees at best. One crack in his fire collar, one shift in the stovepipe from frost heave, and that hay ignites. And where does his family go? They're underground. One door, one narrow vestibule. The smoke alone would kill them before they reached the steps." He paused, letting the mathematics settle. "I've built 14 homes in this county. Every one of them has 2 exits minimum. Fire safety isn't vanity. It's survival." The crowd murmured agreement. On the frontier, fire was not an abstraction. Every family knew someone who had lost a structure to flames. Prairie fires swept the county almost every autumn. A house fire in an underground structure with a single exit was a nightmare no one wanted to contemplate. Reverend Samuel Oakes spoke next, his tone more measured, but his message equally clear. He didn't name Einar directly, but the gathered families understood his meaning immediately. The Lord intended man to walk upright upon the earth, not to burrow beneath it like the creatures of the field. We are called to build homes that lift our families toward heaven, not to bury them in darkness. The Psalms tell us that a wise man builds his house upon the rock. They say nothing about digging a hole and filling it with hay. Then Peter Haskell, the store owner, added a concern that went beyond the Dahl family. "If the county land agent visits," he said, leaning against his counter with the authority of a man who controlled the settlement's access to supplies, "and he sees families living in holes packed with hay and sealed with mud, he'll write us up as a failed settlement. He'll report that we can't build proper shelter." No new families will file claims here. No new business will come. That dugout doesn't just put the dolls at risk, it puts all of us at risk, our reputation, our future. The pressure reached Marta most directly at the Women's Quilting Circle, held every Thursday afternoon in Gerda Knudsen's sod house. Gerda was a Danish immigrant, 10 years older than Marta, established in the community, respected for her practicality and her sharp opinions. When Marta entered the room, conversations quieted. Needles slowed. Eyes met and looked away. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the gathering, Gerda set down her quilting frame and spoke what the other women were thinking. "Marta, dear," she said, her voice carrying a gentleness that made the words harder rather than softer. "You must talk sense to your husband. My Thomas has measured that structure. The hay will rot before Christmas or catch fire before February. And the children, Marta, what kind of mother raises her children underground? They need sunlight. They need air. They need a home they can stand up in without feeling the earth press down on them." Marta, who had watched Einar calculate and test and adjust his plans for months, who had seen him weigh sample hay bales and check them for moisture, who had listened to him explain the root cellar traditions of Trondheim with a quiet certainty she had learned to trust, simply folded her hands in her lap and met Gerda's eyes. "We'll see," she said. "Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish." But privately, even Marta had moments of doubt. The dugout had cost them $50 in lumber, hardware, and the hired mule, nearly a quarter of their annual income. Less than a sod house would have cost, true, but the money was only part of it. The social cost weighed heavier. At church, families sat a little farther from the dolls than they had before. Invitations to shared meals arrived less frequently. The children came home from the settlement small school with questions. "Why do we live in the ground, Mama?" Peter Haskell's boy says we live like badgers. Every evening, when Marta descended the 3 stone steps into the dugout, she noticed the earth smell, the dim light from the single south-facing window set into the hay-wrapped front wall, the low ceiling of cottonwood poles and packed sod. It was warmer than their old sod house had ever been. She could feel that already, even in November. But the closeness of the walls, the weight of the hill above her, the single door that was all that stood between her family and whatever might happen, these things gave her a flutter of uncertainty that she kept hidden from Einar and the children. Einar himself seemed unbothered by the criticism. He continued his preparations through November and into early December, stacking firewood in the vestibule, banking additional earth against the front wall, checking the clay plaster for cracks after each rain, and patching them immediately. When neighbors rode past and called out their jokes, "Digging yourself a grave, doll, or building a barn for your wife, Norwegian," he simply waved and continued working. What none of them knew was that Einar had been keeping careful records since the day the dugout was completed. Each morning and evening he noted the temperature inside the dugout and the temperature outside, using a spirit thermometer he had brought from Trondheim. He recorded the wind direction, the weather conditions, the amount of fuel he burned. By late November, his records showed something remarkable. On a night when the outside temperature dropped to 8 below zero and Thomas Beckwith's frame house interior fell to 41 degrees, the doll dugout held at 59 degrees with the stove banked low, a difference of 18 degrees over the best-built house in the settlement. With less than half the fuel, the records were proof. But proof wouldn't come from a Norwegian immigrant's notebook. Proof would come from survival. And in January 1886, proof was about to arrive with brutal, undeniable force. If you're fascinated by this frontier survival story, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten building wisdom, and comment below. What's the coldest temperature you've ever experienced? Let's see who's really tested their winter survival skills. January 6, 1886, began with an eerie stillness that settled over the Nebraska prairie like held breath. The wind that had scoured the plains for weeks suddenly died. The sky turned a peculiar purple-yellow color along the northwest horizon that settlers who had survived previous winters recognized immediately. "Storm coming," they muttered. "Could be a bad one." They were wrong. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. Late December had been strangely warm, mild enough to melt surface snow and fool settlers into relaxing their preparations. But on the last day of 1885, temperatures began to drop. By January 1st, they were plunging, and on January 6th, the storm that would define a generation of prairie life struck with a violence that left even the most experienced frontiersman speechless. Wind came first, not the steady prairie wind that everyone knew, but explosive gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour that hit the settlement like a wall of moving ice. Then the snow, not falling, but driving horizontally, propelled by winds so fierce that men who stepped outside could not stand upright, could not see their own hands before their faces, could not draw breath without wrapping cloth over their mouths to filter the ice crystals that filled the air like powdered glass. The temperature dropped to 25 below zero on the first night and continued falling. By the second morning, it had reached 30 below, with wind chill driving the effective temperature far colder than any thermometer could measure. For 3 days, the settlement along the South Loop was cut off from the world. Roads vanished under drifts 8 feet deep. The rail line to Broken Bow was blocked by snow, packed so hard against the locomotive that the wheels froze to the tracks and had to be broken free, one car at a time, when the storm finally ended. Livestock caught in the open died where they stood, cattle and horses turning their tails to the wind and drifting until they piled against fence lines and froze in grotesque heaps. A homesteader and his team of 2 horses were found frozen to death within 50 feet of the man's own door, unable to find it in the whiteout. Across the state of Kansas and the Nebraska Territory, more than 100,000 cattle would die before the storm ended. More than 100 people would be found frozen on the open prairie or inside their own homes, homes that had failed them when the cold came with real force for the first time. In the Beckwith household, Thomas fed his cast-iron stove every 15 minutes, pulling firewood from his outdoor stack through a trench he had dug in the snow. Each trip outside was an ordeal. The wind hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped beyond his door, driving ice crystals into his face and down the collar of his coat. His woodpile, which had seemed adequate in November, was diminishing at a rate that frightened him. The wood itself was frozen solid, coated in ice, and hissed and smoked when he laid it on the fire. The flames struggled against the moisture, producing more steam than heat. Every pound of ice on the wood required precious energy just to melt and evaporate before the wood itself could begin to burn. His chimney drafted poorly in the screaming wind, and smoke backed into the room, hanging in a gray haze at ceiling height that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. The interior temperature of his well-built frame house, the best constructed home in the settlement, hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the water bucket beside the stove developed a skin of ice between feedings, cold enough that his wife cooked in her winter coat with a scarf wrapped around her neck, her breath visible in the lamplight, cold enough that his youngest son, James, 4 years old, developed a deep barking cough on the second night that shook his small body and would not stop. Thomas wrapped the boy in every blanket they owned and held him close to the stove, but the cough continued, wet and raw, filling the freezing room with a sound that made Thomas's wife press her hand over her mouth to keep from crying. In the Haskell household, the situation was worse. Peter's sod house held the cold at bay slightly better than Beckwith's frame construction, maintaining 42 degrees, but the wind found every gap in the chinked walls and drove fine snow through cracks that had been invisible before the storm exposed them. White lines of powder appeared on the interior walls like chalk marks drawn by the cold itself. The floor was frigid enough to numb feet through boot leather. Peter's wife laid blankets on the earth floor for the children to sit on, but the chill seeped through. By the second day, Peter had burned through his stored fuel and was breaking apart a wooden bench his wife had brought from Pennsylvania, feeding the splinters to the stove one by one while his children watched in silence. The chair went next, then a shelf, then the frame of a crate that had held their possessions on the journey west. The fire kept the temperature from falling further, but 42 degrees was not warmth. It was just slow freezing instead of fast. Across the settlement, families endured variations of the same crisis. Fuel supplies dwindled or froze useless in outdoor stacks. Homes that had seemed adequate in autumn revealed themselves as thin shells through which the cold poured with relentless persistence. Parents sat awake through the night, feeding their fires, listening to the wind howl against the walls, counting the remaining pieces of wood and wondering if the supply would outlast the storm. The youngest children did not understand why their parents looked so afraid. The oldest understood perfectly. But in the hillside above the South Loup River, something entirely different was happening. Einar Dahl awakened on the first morning of the blizzard and lay still for a moment, listening. He could hear the wind, a distant howl that seemed to come from very far above, muffled by the 6 feet of earth and sod that separated his ceiling from the surface of the hill. The sound was steady but remote, like a storm heard from inside a stone church. He sat up and checked the thermometer he kept mounted on the rear wall. 58 degrees. The stove had burned down to coals overnight. He had not fed it since midnight. He rose, dressed without urgency, and walked to the vestibule. He opened the inner door and stepped into the small enclosed space. The air here was cold, perhaps 30 degrees, but still no wind. He pushed the outer door open a few inches, and the storm hit him. Wind shrieked past the opening, driving snow horizontally. The temperature difference between the vestibule and the outside air was violent, instantaneous. He closed the outer door. The vestibule went quiet again. He opened the inner door and stepped back into the dugout. 58 degrees. No wind had entered. No cold air had rushed through. The two-door system had worked exactly as Einar had designed it, exactly as Norwegian farmers had designed it for centuries. He placed 3 pieces of split cottonwood on the coals and opened the stove damper. Within 10 minutes, the fire was burning cleanly, the dry wood catching immediately with bright flame and minimal smoke. The wood had been stored inside the dugout vestibule, protected from snow and ice, and its moisture content was low enough to burn efficiently. No hissing, no steaming, no fighting with ice-logged fuel. By mid-morning, the thermometer read 66 degrees. By early afternoon, it held steady at 68. Marta cooked breakfast without her coat. The children, Anders, Kristen, and little Eric, ate at the table in their regular clothes, their faces flushed with the warmth from the stove, and the radiant heat from the earth wall behind it. That wall, 12 feet of packed clay and loam that stretched deep into the hillside, had been absorbing heat from the stove for months. Now, with the stove burning steadily, it radiated warmth back into the room like a massive stone hearth, supplementing the fire and stabilizing the temperature so effectively that fluctuations were measured in single degrees rather than the 20-degree swings that plagued above-ground homes every time someone opened a door or the fire burned low. Einar fed the stove every 90 minutes, not every 15 minutes like Thomas Beckwith, not every 20 minutes like Peter Haskell. Every hour and a half, he added wood to a fire that burned cleanly in a room that held its heat, because the earth held it, because the hay sealed it, because the vestibule protected it. On the afternoon of the second day, during a brief lull when the wind dropped from screaming to merely howling, Thomas Beckwith pulled on every piece of clothing he owned and fought through chest-deep snow toward the Dahl homestead. He told himself he was checking on them, making sure they hadn't suffocated in that hole, making sure the hay hadn't caught fire, making sure the roof hadn't collapsed under the weight of drifting snow. He told himself he was being a good neighbor. But part of Thomas, the part that had measured and calculated and publicly condemned the dugout as a death trap, needed to know. He found the entrance by the thin trail of chimney smoke that rose from the mound of the hillside and was immediately torn away by the wind. He descended the 3 stone steps that led down to the outer vestibule door. Here, in the shallow cut below ground level, the wind diminished. Snow had drifted against the steps, but the door was accessible. He knocked. Marta opened the outer vestibule door and ushered him inside. Thomas stood in the small enclosed space, stomping snow from his boots, feeling the air change around him. The vestibule was cold but calm. No wind, no driving snow. A between space, neither inside nor outside. Then Marta opened the inner door, and a wave of warm, earth-scented air rolled through the vestibule and washed over Thomas Beckwith with a force that stopped him in his tracks. He stood in the inner doorway and stared. The dugout was warm, not survivable, not barely adequate. Warm. The children were sitting on the packed earth floor near the stove, Anders whittling a piece of cottonwood, while Kristen showed little Eric how to stack small stones. They were in their regular clothes. No coats, no blankets wrapped around their shoulders. The lamplight was steady, and the air was clean, warm, dry, faintly scented with earth and wood smoke. There was no haze of smoke hanging at the ceiling, no frost on the walls, no ice in the water bucket. The thermometer on the rear wall read 67 degrees. Thomas's own house, the best-built house in the settlement, was at 38 degrees. His son was coughing so hard he couldn't sleep. His wife was burning their furniture. "How?" Thomas asked. His voice was barely a whisper. The word came out rough, as though something had caught in his throat. Einar set down the piece of harness leather he had been repairing and gestured at the walls around them. The earth walls, the hay-wrapped front, the closed vestibule door behind Thomas. "The ground is warm," he said. 50 degrees always, even now. The hay holds the warmth in. The doors keep the cold out. I only heat by 15 degrees to be comfortable. You must heat by 80 degrees, and your walls lose it as fast as you make it." Thomas said nothing for a long time. He looked at the rear wall, where the earth was visibly warm to the touch, radiating the stored heat from the stove. He looked at the front wall, where 18 inches of compressed hay beneath a layer of intact clay plaster stood between the room and the full force of the blizzard. He could not feel a single draft, not from the walls, not from the ceiling, not from the floor. The room was still and warm in a way his own house had never been, not on the mildest autumn day, not at the peak of a roaring fire. "That hay," Thomas said slowly, "I said it would rot or burn." Einar reached up and touched the interior surface of the hay-wrapped front wall. It was dry, firm, cool to the touch but not cold. The clay plaster on the outside was keeping moisture away from the hay. The hay was performing exactly as it had in Norwegian barns for centuries, trapping air in millions of tiny pockets between the compressed stalks, creating a barrier that heat could not easily cross. "Dry," Einar said. "The clay keeps the water out. The hay keeps the heat in. It will not rot, and it will not burn, unless your stovepipe fails, and mine will not fail." He pointed to the earthen collar around the chimney pipe. 14 inches of stone and packed clay between the pipe and the nearest hay. "I am careful." Thomas returned to his own freezing house that afternoon with a new understanding forming in his mind, one that contradicted everything he had said publicly, everything he had calculated, everything he believed about proper construction. But pride is a difficult thing to surrender, especially for a man who has staked his professional reputation on a judgment. He said nothing to the others, not yet. The storm broke on the 4th day. Families emerged from their battered homes to find the prairie transformed. Snow drifts reached the eaves of sod houses and buried fence lines entirely. Livestock lay frozen across the open range. Fuel supplies throughout the settlement were devastated, not merely burned through, but destroyed. Wood that had been stored outdoors was frozen solid, ice-logged, nearly impossible to light. Coal supplies were exhausted. Families who had burned furniture would need to replace it come spring, an expense most could not afford. Einar Dahl climbed the 3 stone steps from his vestibule and emerged into the pale winter light with his 3 children behind him. All of them warm, all of them well fed. His fuel supply, stored in the protected vestibule and inside the dugout itself, remained adequate. He had burned perhaps half a cord during the entire storm, roughly 1/3 what Thomas Beckwith had consumed and less than a quarter of what Peter Haskell had burned before resorting to his furniture. The questions began within hours. Families who had heard about the Dahl's comfort during the blizzard wanted details, but skepticism ran deep. People needed proof, not impressions, not a Norwegian's word. Measurable, undeniable evidence, Thomas Beckwith decided to provide it. On January 25, 1886, nearly 3 weeks after the storm, he arrived at the Dahl Dugout with a mercury thermometer he had ordered from Omaha before the blizzard, and that had finally arrived by post. "I want to measure everything," he told Einar. "Temperature, fuel consumption, moisture, structural integrity, everything. And I want to compare it to my own house under identical conditions." Einar agreed immediately. He had been keeping his own records since October, but having an independent investigator, especially one who had publicly condemned the structure, would carry weight that his own measurements never could. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas made daily visits, each morning at sunrise, again at noon, and once more at sunset. He recorded temperatures in both dwellings with his calibrated thermometer. He counted every piece of fuel consumed, estimated its weight and volume, and tracked consumption rates with the same precision he applied to measuring lumber for a house frame. He checked the hay insulation at 4 points around the structure, pressing his palm flat against the interior surface and noting the temperature by feel, confirming his impressions with the thermometer. He examined the clay plaster outside for cracks, measured the depth of earth cover over the roof, and tested the vestibule doors for draft leaks by holding a candle flame at the seams and watching for flicker. The results were not close. The Dahl Dugout maintained an average interior temperature of 64 degrees throughout the measurement period, with a low of 58 degrees on the coldest night and a high of 69 degrees on a day when the stove burned hot for cooking. The Beckwith house, comparable in floor area, equipped with a similar cast iron stove, averaged 44 degrees, with a low of 36 and a high of 51. That 20-degree differential represented an enormous gap in livability, not a marginal improvement, not a slight edge. The difference between a home where children could play and learn and grow, and a shelter where survival consumed every waking thought. The difference between health and chronic illness, between comfort and endurance. But the fuel data was even more striking. Over those 3 February weeks, the Dahl household burned approximately half a cord of mixed fuel, mostly cottonwood and twisted hay, supplemented with a small amount of purchased coal. The Beckwith household, attempting to maintain any semblance of warmth, consumed nearly 2 full cords, 4 times the fuel for 20 fewer degrees of comfort. Thomas sat in his own cold house one evening and worked through the mathematics with a pencil stub on the back of a feed bill. Extrapolated across a full winter, Einar would burn roughly 2.5 cords of fuel. Thomas's family would need 8 to 9 cords for far less comfort. In a region where fuel was scarce and expensive, the savings represented $25 to $30 per winter, enough to buy a milk cow, a year's supply of flour, or the lumber for a proper barn. The dugout's entire construction cost of $50 would be recovered in fuel savings within 2 winters. After that, every dollar saved was pure gain year after year for as long as the structure stood. Thomas also inspected the hay insulation with meticulous care. He peeled back a small section of the clay plasterer at one corner and examined the hay beneath. He expected rot, mold, dampness, the early stages of structural failure. Instead, the hay was dry, sound, intact. The clay plaster had prevented external moisture from reaching it, and the vapor management properties of the clay had allowed any internal condensation to escape slowly outward. The hay bales were performing their insulating function as effectively as the day Einar had stacked them. He examined the stovepipe fire collar, 14 inches of packed earth and flat stone, exactly as Einar had described. The hay nearest the chimney showed no discoloration, no heat damage, no charring. Thomas's most dire prediction, the one he had presented to the community with such confidence, had been wrong. On February 15th, Thomas Beckwith presented his findings to a gathering at Haskell's store. 31 adults attended, nearly every family in the settlement. I was wrong. He began with those 3 words and let them hang in the cold air of the room. Then he opened his notebook and walked the assembled families through 3 weeks of meticulous data. The temperature differential, 64 degrees versus 44 degrees. The fuel consumption, half a cord versus 2 cords. The structural integrity of the hay insulation, the dryness, the soundness, the complete absence of the fire risk he had warned about. The ground beneath us, Thomas explained, is not frozen, not at 5 or 6 feet down. It stays close to 50 or 55 degrees year-round, even when the air above drops to 30 below. Dahl didn't build a hole. He built a house that starts at 50 degrees before he lights a match. The hay holds that warmth in. The clay keeps the hay dry. The vestibule keeps the cold air out. Every element works together. It is the most thermally efficient structure I have ever seen, and I have built 14 houses. Peter Haskell raised his hand from the back of the room. That's impressive mathematics, Thomas, but it's still a hole in the ground. No proper windows, no dignity. No family should have to live underground like that, no matter how warm it is. Thomas shook his head. I calculated the fuel savings, Peter. At current prices, the Dahl dugout pays for a proper windowed addition within 2 winters, maybe less. And I'll say something else. He paused, his voice steady, but waited with something that sounded like regret. During the storm, your family burned your furniture to stay alive at 42 degrees. His children were playing on the floor at 68 degrees. Which family was living with more dignity? The room went quiet. Then Agnes Beckwith, Thomas's own wife, spoke from the second row. Her voice was hesitant but clear. My James, she said, his cough from the storm hasn't gone away. I took him to the doctor in Grand Island last week. The doctor says it's from breathing freezing air and smoke for 4 days. Says our house was too cold and the fire smoked too much from wet fuel. She paused and looked across the room at Marta Dahl. Your children didn't get sick at all, did they? No, Einar said from the back of the room. The air was warm and the stove burned clean wood stored inside. Clean fire makes less smoke. Warm air keeps lungs healthy. Simple. That word hung in the air. Simple. The entire engineering principle that had kept his family safe, warm, and healthy through the worst blizzard in Nebraska memory, reduced to its essence. The earth is warm. The hay holds the warmth. The clay keeps the hay dry. The vestibule keeps the cold out. Simple. But simplicity the families were beginning to understand was not the same thing as primitive. One by one, men approached Einar after the meeting. Would you help me find a south-facing slope on my claim? How thick does the hay need to be? What kind of clay works best for the plaster? Can I use straw instead of hay? How deep do I dig? What about the vestibule? How wide does it need to be? The Norwegian root cellar builder who had been called mad, dangerous, and primitive was suddenly the most sought-after advisor in the settlement. Einar answered every question with the same patient precision he had applied to the construction itself, sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining drainage angles and hay compression techniques and clay mixing ratios to men who weeks earlier had called his home a death trap. Peter Haskell, the store owner who had worried about the settlement's reputation, was the last to approach. He waited until the others had left. "Doll," he said quietly, standing at the door of his own store, "I owe you an apology. I said your home would hurt this community. Instead, it might be the thing that saves it. If we can keep families warm on a third of the fuel, more homesteaders will survive their first winter. More claims will be proved up. More families will stay." He extended his hand. Einar shook it. By the spring of 1886, Einar Dahl had helped design earth-sheltered dugouts for 9 families along the South Loop River. He didn't charge for his expertise. He considered it knowledge that belonged to everyone, the same way Norwegian farmers had shared their building methods across valleys and generations for centuries. But the families insisted on compensating him somehow, and Einar found himself with offers of labor, seed, livestock, and goodwill that made his homestead more prosperous than he could have imagined. Thomas Beckwith became Einar's most dedicated student. The Ohio carpenter, who had publicly called the dugout a death trap, now incorporated earth sheltering and hay insulation into every structure he designed. He modified the technique for different terrain and purposes, developing variations for families without south-facing hills by digging shallow pits and berming earth against the walls. By the winter of 1886 to 1887, 15 families within a 40-mile radius of the settlement were living in what they had begun calling Norwegian burrows, or hay dugouts. The technique spread through the Scandinavian and German-Russian immigrant communities first. They recognized the earth-sheltering principle from traditional building methods in their home countries, adapted now to the specific conditions of the Nebraska prairie. But within 2 years, even American-born settlers who had initially mocked the concept were adopting it. The evidence was too compelling to ignore. Word reached the Nebraska Agricultural Extension Office by 1888. A field agent traveled to Custer County specifically to document the hay dugout phenomenon. His report included drawings, measurements, and interviews with families who had lived through multiple winters in both above-ground and earth-sheltered homes. The agent calculated that a properly built hay-insulated dugout reduced winter fuel consumption by approximately 60% compared to standard sod houses of comparable size, while maintaining interior temperatures 20 to 30 degrees warmer. The report noted something else significant. Families living in earth-sheltered homes reported fewer respiratory illnesses during winter months. The combination of warmer air, cleaner burning fires from properly stored fuel, and the absence of drafts created healthier living conditions. Childhood sickness during winter was measurably lower in dugout families than in those living in above-ground sod houses or frame shanties. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Einar's innovation was what it anticipated. The principles he employed, using the Earth's constant temperature as a thermal base, insulating exposed surfaces with compressed natural fiber, sealing that insulation against moisture with a vapor-permeable clay layer, preventing heat loss through airlock entry systems, these are fundamentally identical to what modern building scientists call earth-sheltered design and straw bale construction. Contemporary straw bale walls achieve R30 to R33, nearly identical to what Einar's 18 inches of compressed hay delivered. Passive House Standards, the most energy-efficient building certification in the world, employ the same thermal principles that a Norwegian farmer applied with a spade, a mule, and a pit of river clay in 1885. Modern geothermal heating systems exploit the same constant ground temperature that Einar used as his thermal base, pumping fluid through underground pipes to capture the Earth's steady 50 to 55 degrees. Engineers and architects spend years studying these principles in universities. Einar learned them watching his father build root cellars in the hills above Trondheim. What frontier neighbors called dangerous and primitive turned out to be profoundly advanced engineering disguised in hay and dirt. The building techniques that earned Einar ridicule in 1885 would earn an architect awards in 2025. Einar himself never promoted his design as revolutionary. When asked about it in later years, he shrugged and said, "In Trondheim, we don't fight the ground. We use it. The earth is already warm. The hay keeps the warmth where it belongs. This isn't new. Farmers in Norway have known this for 500 years. I just brought it with me." He lived in the dugout, expanded over the years with a proper windowed south-facing addition that Thomas Beckwith helped design and build, until 1911, when his children had grown and the original homestead passed to his eldest son, Anders. The earth-sheltered core of the structure remained sound for over 40 years. When it was finally dismantled in the 1920s to make way for a modern frame house, workers who peeled back the clay plaster found the original hay insulation still dry, still intact, still firmly packed between the courses. The earth walls showed no deterioration. The cottonwood roof poles were solid. The packed earth floor was as level and firm as the day it had been laid. 40 years of Nebraska weather, blizzards, heat waves, thunderstorms, and brutal winds had barely touched the protected core of the structure. Hit that like button if this story changed how you think about building and insulation. Subscribe for more forgotten frontier wisdom that still works today. And drop a comment. Would you live in a hay-wrapped dugout if you were homesteading in a cold climate? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts. What Einar proved wasn't that his neighbors were ignorant. They were practical people doing their best with the knowledge they had. He proved something more profound and more humbling. That dismissing unfamiliar approaches without testing them is an error as old as human settlement. That confusing simple with primitive blinds us to solutions that are sitting beneath our feet. That assuming traditional knowledge from another culture has nothing to teach us about our own problems is a mistake that costs lives, health, and comfort every generation. It's repeated. The hay-wrapped dugout stands as a monument to a different kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of expensive materials, but the wisdom of understanding what the earth already provides. Not the wisdom of building higher and grander, but the wisdom of building smarter and warmer. Not the wisdom of fighting the ground, but the wisdom of working with it. In February 1886, when Thomas Beckwith stood before his neighbors and said those 3 words, "I was wrong," he did something remarkably brave. He let evidence overrule his ego. He let his thermometer matter more than his reputation. He chose truth over pride. That choice, repeated by family after family across the county in the years that followed, turned a dangerous death trap into a regional building tradition that saved fuel, protected health, and sheltered families through some of the harshest winters the Nebraska frontier ever endured. The neighbors stopped laughing and started learning, because sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one who actually understands what's happening. Sometimes what looks like a death trap is actually the safest place on the prairie. And sometimes digging into the earth isn't giving up on building a home. It's the smartest building of all. Einar Dahl knew that. The earth beneath his feet had been telling him for years. He just had the sense to listen. Educational note. This script presents historical frontier building techniques for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles described are sound and based on real physics, modern construction should always follow current building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering guidance. The hay dugout design represents historical adaptation to specific frontier conditions and should not be replicated without proper consultation with licensed builders and compliance with local regulations.